Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. I don't think I need to tell anyone that politics and government and civics is a hot topic right now for various reasons, and it's an important one. For example, recently I was working in a school and I was talking with a teacher around the time of the election, the national election, and she was really upset about one particular political event that was going on. And she wasn't really happy about how either candidate was approaching it. So she decided not to vote. And while that is her right to not vote, that is a right of citizenship in the United States, I was a little disappointed by that because I do see voting as our right in a democracy and an important one if we are to get the leadership that we want to get. I thought not only because of that experience, but just because of everything going on politically, especially in the United States, but we could even talk about globally, political shifts and changes globally. I thought it would be really important and a good opportunity on the podcast to talk about what does it mean to be a citizen and how should we as educators be teaching our students to be civically engaged so they do vote, for example. For this reason, I'm really excited to have Lindsey Cormack on the show. Lindsey is assistant professor of quantitative social sciences at the Stevens Institute of Technology, and she is also the author of a great new book titled How to Raise a Citizen. Lindsey, thank you so much for being on the show.
John, thank you so much for having me.
Lindsey, one question I'd like to start off with is what prompted you to write this book about raising a citizen or raising citizens?
I've been at Stevens Institute of Technology for 10 years now. And when I started there, I was in awe of how good my students were. They're not just good in a disciplinary sense, but they're really go-getters. They're very good at doing school, great at taking tests. But when it comes to the very basics of American government, most of them did not know the contours, the players, the levels of power that they had. And that was sort of a shock to me. It was also the case that when I started on, I got voluntold that I would be the person who was organizing our voter registration drives and our take the ducks to the polls thing to get our college students to vote. And I took that on in earnest, but I found that every time we had one of these events where we were taking voters to the polls and then having like an ice cream party afterwards, I'd have multiple students who were turned away because they weren't registered to vote and they didn't know they had to, or they were registered in their hometown and they were in a different place and they couldn't cast a ballot unless it was an affidavit ballot. And that was hard to watch because they think they're doing, I'm an adult now, I can do this neat new thing. And then they're crestfallen when they're told, I'm sorry, 30 days ago, you didn't fill out this paperwork, so you're not actually going to get to exercise your right. Seeing that over a series of years and with the promotion of tenure, I had a little bit more leeway to research something that I wanted to do. And so I had 6 student RAs do this with me, and we took to the nation looking at all the curricular requirements across the United States. We interviewed teachers in nearly every state to get the foundational pieces of this book together. And I consider it a love letter to college students because I know that the stories about them being apathetic or not caring, that's not really what's happening here. Oftentimes they do not know how to engage. And I know that it's hard to get all that work done. And so I wrote this book to say we need to do better at that if we want the health of our democratic republic to thrive and even grow in the coming years.
So most of your research, Lindsey, is on the college level or dealing with college students. But in your research, did you do any outreach or did you speak with any, say, K-12 teachers?
All the interviews happened with K through 12 teachers. I work in a university setting, but this book is about the K through 12 setting. And in doing so, we found most of the time the work around politics and government instructions happens in a social studies course, which might happen in seventh or eighth grade, and then maybe again in 11th and 12th grade in government or an AP class. There's not a lot in the K through 5 that we talked to, but mostly it's in the seventh and eighth and then 11th and 12th.
And now you were talking about the impetus for this book being that a lot of your college students didn't know how to navigate our democratic process. You already more or less foreshadowed or answered part of my next question, but I'd love to go a little bit deeper on the following, Lindsay, and that is, why do you think it's important, particularly now, to talk about how to teach civics or citizenship?
There are a lot of reasons, but one of the things pressing now is that many children lack a model for how to do this friction or discourse in a way that is civil and helpful. Oftentimes, what they're seeing on television or in short social media clips is outrage followed by other outrage, or disbelief, or thinking the person who disagrees with you is either an idiot or evil. It's really important that we give them models and we give them opportunities to practice the skills of developing opinions, clashing with others, come to productive an outcome, which might be compromise. It might be learning. It might be neither, but it might not be outrage. And so I think it's important for us to do this sort of work so that we can turn the temperature down on our politics overall, but we also elevate this notion of patriotism, of what it is to be an American and how neat it is to live in a country that allows you to control your outcomes by participating in the democratic process. There are so many reasons that I think it's valuable to do this work now, but the key one is a lot of our children just aren't seeing how to do this because many of our adults were under practiced and under taught in the first place. And that's where we are today, where we have the opportunity to change it.
You lead right into my next question, Lindsay, which is, how should we be teaching civics? You already talked about the fact that maybe our students get it in middle school and then they maybe get it in government class in 11th and 12th grade. That's traditionally how our students learn about civics. And let's face it, when it's not a tested subject like ELA or math, it even gets more short thrift. How would you suggest, Lindsay, we think about teaching civics perhaps in a more creative and useful way? What are your thoughts on that?
The point about if it's not tested, it's not taught is well taken and something that we heard in many of our interviews. But something else that's curious to me is that with every other skill, we layer in a K through 12 way. With math, we start with very fundamental building blocks about what number units are and then how you can combine them and then how you can divide them. And we build over time. We do the same with science. We do the same with writing. Think about all these other subjects in a layered scaffolding way. With civics, we dip in middle school and dip in high school, but a curriculum that recognizes there are touch points to civics in every year is more beneficial than one that drops in at 2 points in a child's development. I also know that the way that we teach civics varies across the country, private, independent, parochial, all the different schools have different approaches to it. But in the people who study what is like an effective form of teaching this subject matter, they will tell you that experiential learning is by far better than the theoretical premise many of our programs use. When we talk to children, they'll say they learn about civics as history, where it's this play that happened 2,000 years ago, not 250 years ago in their mind. These old guys got together, they built this great system, and now they're spectators instead of participants. We need to put our children back into the role of understanding that they are citizens. They are people who are capable of changing their outcomes. They just need to know what levers to pull on and who's responsible for what. And the last thing that I'll say, when we think about how we teach kids about this, it cannot be all negative. Our children get a very negative message about what government is from an early age before anyone's even talking to them. And this happens in the form of children's literature and children's entertainment. If you think about cartoons or if you think about the comic books you might have read, if they have a physical character that's representative of the government, it'll usually be the mayor. And at best, that mayor is going to be some sort of bumbling doofus who just barely gets things right. And at worst, the mayor of The Simpsons, where they're out to do harm to their city. We need to show our kids the positive role models, the ability to change outcomes by using these pathways, and we have to do it in many more years than we're doing it right now. I understand the constraints of that are hard, which is why I wrote this book to not only help educators, but to help parents do the work in their own homes.
I love that. There's so much to unpack there, Lindsay. One, You said it's important for our students to learn civics, not as a historical event, but as an ongoing process of democracy, and that they themselves need to and should be participating in that process. And you say to do that through experiential learning. Could you give us some examples of what that could look like?
There's three basic examples that I know that are employed in different parts of the New York school system. One is you can do things where you'll have children go out, find something in their communities, and try to get it changed. I'll give you an example of something that was happening in the East Bronx Academy for the Future last year. When New York City legalized marijuana, we had a lot of gray zone marijuana shops that were opening up that hadn't gone through the licensing procedures. They were too close to schools, too close to houses of worship. And so some students in the East Bronx Academy for the Future got together and said, we're going to make a survey of all the illegal shops in our area, and then we're going to go figure out whose job it is to regulate, shut down, or make sure that these can no longer operate near our schools. Doing something like that doesn't always result in immediate success, but there is so much learning and figuring out, oh, who is the person to call for this? I'm not going to call the president. My member of Congress probably doesn't care because it's a state policy thing, not a federal policy thing. But figuring those things out is one really good way for children to understand how the system interlocks and how they can get into different pieces. The other two are more straightforward. We have student governments in every state, but often they take the role of party planning committees where they're essentially organizing a dance or an event, a carnival, versus a body that's making changes for the school or in after school programs or something like that. So really enriching what can happen in student government can be another thing. And the third thing that a few schools in New York City are toying with and schools across the country is this idea of participatory budgeting. So you might give a class, say you guys are going to get $3,000. Why don't you come up with some proposals for how you're going to spend it? And they can campaign with each other. Oh, I want to make sure we have pizza parties on Friday. Oh, I want to have better equipment in this lab that I haven't been able to work in as well as I wanted to. Whatever it is, giving them the ability to see what it is to create policy, seek consensus, campaign for an issue. And those are not in the formal routes of power. Those aren't formal politics, but it's all developing that civic skill set within someone instead of seeing it as something that other people do or people when they get older can participate.
As you were speaking, Lindsay, I was thinking also about, and you probably have heard of this, the Newark public school system, I believe, is allowing 16-year-olds to vote in board elections. Do you know much about that? What's going on with that? And what are your feelings on that activity?
I can't speak to that with any greater detail than what you've provided. I know that in some municipalities, we're letting 16-year-olds vote on school board elections. And then there's also moves like Hoboken, we have a youth advisory council, which is someone who sits within the city council level of government where they say, oh, here's what I think about this road protection near my school. Any of the things that allow us to practice that muscle of voting or engaging are probably net beneficial because one of the reasons we see lower voter turnout from 18 to 24-year-olds, our newest voters, is simply that they haven't had the practice and they don't know how to do it. Things like letting 16-year-olds vote in select elections, I don't really understand the downside, although I'm sure there are opponents to that like there are for anything. And I'd be for things that allow students and children to practice these sorts of things.
I suppose the downside would be, I'm not saying I agree with it, that they're young, they don't completely understand the issues, but even adults might not have all the information they need to make, quote unquote, an educated decision. But that's why it's also important in terms of raising a citizen to also help our students to learn how to research issues. Have you done any work with students on that aspect of being a citizen?
I haven't worked with students trying to figure out where they're going to vote if they have the eligibility at 16, but I do know for my 18-year-olds that I have in college, we talk about how they're going to source their information, how they're going to figure things out. And something that might be disheartening, but it's probably something that many of us can understand, is that oftentimes they're not really information seekers, they're information consumers, and their consumption pattern is done through whatever an algorithm is going to shunt into their phone, essentially. Like that's where the research is coming from. I did have a project this last fall semester in my Intro to American Government class where we set up two Finstas, which are fake Instagram accounts. And we set up one where I asked them, I want you all, and I only have 22 students, so everyone needs to come up with a conservative word that we can have a following for a hashtag or a conservative voice, and then the same for a liberal. And we had these two competing fake Instagrams, and every Thursday we would watch 4 minutes on one and then 4 minutes on the other. And what they were able to realize is that there was zero overlap in the content that were in those two different accounts. And so you can sort of walk through the world going in a totally different reality from someone else when you're doing that information seeking, which is really more like information consuming. Part of what we can do is just make it clear to them with projects or experiments like that. Okay, there's a lot in this world, a lot's going to come at you. It's better if you can take the reins and try to figure things out versus letting the horses just trample you with whatever they think you want to hear.
How would you recommend we get our young people shifting from consuming to seeking information about candidates, platforms? What are some ways that you would recommend for our teachers listening today, different resources that they could steer their students towards?
The best thing that we can do as adults is model what that behavior looks like because if they don't see these things, they're not going to understand how to do them or the value in doing them. I do have a website that's associated with the book called howtoraiseacitizen.com, and in the resources page, I know that the K through 12 space is sort of awash with a bunch of different nonprofits and for-profit vendors who are willing to say, here's how you can lesson plan on this and that. Something that I find as useful for my students is I say, instead of reading a report about someone or watching a news article online about them, go figure out who they are. And what I mean by that is go to the website that they have created, go to the Twitter that they are doing. If you can find them at an event, go see them and experience them because there's nothing that can really replace your sense of trust or your sense of, is this person going to be an effective advocate for my interests until you're in the room with them. And all the other pieces are narrativized, where you have someone else who's mediating the story or saying, they said this, can you believe it? Instead of you just seeing what they've said themselves and then you deciding for your own self if you believe it or not. Things that push them to go figure out who the people are instead of what other people say they are is a really good move. And there's a lot of routes to do that.
You've talked already about a lot of ways we can help our students become more civically engaged and what we as the adults can be doing to help our students learn those skills of discernment and evaluation. I'm going to ask this. You do a lot of work, Lindsay, in schools across the nation on what civics education is, what it can be. Are there any particular K-12 schools in the research that you did while you were out there at those schools that you thought, hey, this school's really doing a great job in teaching civics? And what are some of the schools doing?
That is a great question. Something that I learned from a top level is that I think the private schools, the independent schools, tend to have a better grasp on the importance of this than the public schools. And it might not just be the grasp, but it might be what they're charged with and what they're able to do curricularly, having more independence in how they're forming those decisions. But I did find that in private schools, the parents were receptive, whereas in public schools, there's not as much attention given. You also have a student population that is sometimes struggling in other sorts of things like English as a language. And so it's like if you have people struggling with this, you're not also going to be layering on, oh, make sure you think about federalism. The sad reality is that I confronted is that there is differences across different types of schools. But in terms of schools that are in that public sphere and are trying their best, I really would point back to the East Bronx Academy for the future. We're all in on this Civics Weeks that happens in March, where they brought in speakers who were their local representatives. They had students doing workshops on how to disagree. We had 4 different topics to disagree on. And so places that value it and prioritize it, whether that be in a civics week or around some sort of election, I think that is a better way because I also heard, and I do hear this when I go to different places, that schools will say to teachers, don't talk about this election, or we're not going to do this because we don't want the parents or the community to get inflamed. I understand the impulse, I understand the protective measures that those encompass, but they do damage because our public schools are policy implements. They are funded by taxpayer dollars. The decisions that happen in public schools are made by either political appointees or elected officials. And so by opting out of that conversation because we don't want to face parental blowback, we're really doing a disservice to our students because we're not teaching them how to do this. And instead we're saying, I guess someone else will take care of it.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because I do think there is a lot of fear out there and not unjustified when we look at in some places there is legislation being passed that teachers have to be very careful what they say. Can you give teachers any advice on how they can be teaching civics but doing it in a way where they're not getting in trouble.
That was something we heard a lot in our interviews was parents are part of the problem because even well-meaning teachers who will say there's three branches of government. The first branch is the Congress. The legislative branch has this power. Someone might go home and their parent might be, oh my God, they talked about the Congress, not the president. They don't like the president. And then they inflame a Facebook group or email a principal or badger the teacher themselves. No one wants that. One of the best things you can do is make sure that the parents are folded into this exercise and recognize that you're not in the interest of teaching someone how to be a little Democrat or teaching someone how to be a little Republican, but rather that you're teaching them how to be a citizen. And an analogy that I like to use is trying to raise someone who is an athlete or raise someone who is a spectator. If we're raising athletes, we do things like teach them the rules of the game, have them do scrimmages, figure out what strategy can be, study the plays. If we just want them to be a spectator, we might teach them like, here's the chance, here's how you paint your face, we cheer for this person, we boo for this person. But in politics, we don't really have the luxury of trying to cultivate spectators. We're really raising athletes because all of our bodies are in this political playing field. We can be better equipped or worse equipped to do it. And so I think if you sort of level set, and I understand that's incredibly hard to do in many parts of the country and in all sorts of red or blue places because you have parents who hold really strong ideas on these things, but level setting that you're teaching them the rules to be a good athlete, not the rules so that they can pick a side. They'll pick a side. They'll figure it out when it matters to them, but they're not going to be able to play the game if they're never taught the rules.
And so, speaking about knowing the rules, because and looping back to something you were saying before that I wanted to get back to, and that is when you were talking about layering the curriculum, layering civics like we layer math instruction or literacy instruction. What does that layering look like in terms of civics?
It depends on where you're at. What we mostly struggle with is that we fetishize and focus on the federal government. And part of that is because it's the biggest, baddest, most powerful one. It's also where we have most of the resources. But for so many quality of life issues, that actually happens at the state or local level. And in many ways, the lessons that you give on the federal government can be replicated in a state or local context with all sorts of variations. For instance, when I teach Intro to American Government, we start with the federal apparatus and we work through that for a number of weeks, rooted in the Constitution, and then getting into policy implementation. And then we move on to the state government, which the basic premise is the same, at least in New Jersey. There's a few extra powers that the governor has. The judicial branch is a little bit different. And then we work down into local politics. And so it really depends on where people's starting points are. And I think for most people, we don't even have that foundational piece. We don't even have the federal government. But the irony of this is, in a world where everything is changing, everything's algorithmically cut up, our foundational documents are going to stay the same. And so, if we could graduate students who have read the Constitution, which is only like 19 pages long, we would be so further ahead than we are right now because most of our students get out of high school not even knowing this document. Once you got that, you can piece a lot of other things together. Start there and then move down into the layers of government that are actually closer to home as you go.
Lindsay, you're talking about the Constitution. For a lot of teachers, it's really hard for them to teach that in an interesting, exciting way. How would you recommend they make the Constitution, this couple hundred-year old document, come alive?
Oh gosh, I think there's actually a lot of great ways to do this. If you wanted like a one-stop shop to look at the resources, James Madison's Montpelier, which is where James Madison, father of the Constitution, creates and drafts this document. They have so many good things from different age groups to look at like how you can make this come alive. But I'll tell you something that I do with younger students. The first thing I do is I ask them all to tell me about a game that they like playing and say, and only tell me about three rules about it so I can get it. So for soccer, they'll say, kick the ball into the goal, block it from others. And I say, okay, you guys know how to do rules. And then I'll say, let's say we have a playground that has three swings and 10 students show up and want to swing. What sort of rules would you set up for that? And students, children generally go to fairness. Well, they'll say something like everyone gets 10 pushes or everyone gets a minute and they rotate. And then I'll complicate it and I'll say, okay, Same 10 students are here, but one of them was bullying another one yesterday. And they'll say, oh, then that person has to go last, or then that person only gets 30 seconds, or maybe they don't even get to go at all. So they have a punitive impulse. And then you'll say, oh, and this person, their dog died and they're feeling really sad. And then they might say, oh, they get to go first, or they get extra pushes, or they get to go multiple times. And so they have this reward or empathy piece. And then you can add in all sorts of things that might make sense in your context. And at the end, the takeaway is creating rules are hard. People come to this with different needs. There's going to be different examples or settings where we have to change things. And that's why we get into a constitution. What were they trying to do? They're trying to make rules in a new world that they haven't understood other than having a king who's saying, like, here's how it's going to be. And so going through exercises like that and plenty others that I really, again, I can't say enough about James Madison's Montpelier. I think there are ways to do this, even though it might seem daunting.
Lindsay, what have we not discussed about civics education?
The term civics is sometimes a little bit boring, and I think people don't always know what it means. I like to encourage us to think about politics and government not as dirty words, but as words that touch everything. Just because you're a teacher who's teaching science or a teacher who might be having PE, that doesn't mean there isn't a way for you to be a good civic role model by engaging politics and government in the things that you're doing. That can be as simple as saying, wow, isn't it great that we have these basketball courts? Yeah, I think we voted for those 3 years ago, or whatever it is. Finding those connections, because there are political influences on everything that we do and touch, and government has a hand in those things. So recognizing that beyond a civics or social studies classroom can be something that shows students, this isn't just something that my one teacher cares about. It's something that they're going to get as a multiplied message if different teachers show them the inputs, which are all there if we're just willing to see them.
And the focus of your book, in large part, is also what parents can be doing. Let's talk about that for a moment. What can parents be doing to help their children become more civically engaged?
For the very youngest of children, we have to make sure that we don't knee jerk into all negative politics, because there's two sorts of strategies that we found throughout the country when we're talking about families. One is don't talk about politics. I was raised in Kansas, and a lot of the Midwest and the South holds some of these things as taboo. Politics is off limits, sex is off limits. We're not talking about money, we're not talking about religion. That doesn't serve anyone, because they are all going to graduate and grow up into a political system. And if they don't have practice talking about it, they're not going to understand how to get started. But the second thing that we found, which is more of a coastal phenomena, is this idea of hating politics. The whole system is rigged. Every politician is a liar. They're all corrupt and in it for themselves. And if all of our kids just hear us bad mouthing people who are doing this, they're not going to want to get involved. And something that I talk about when I'm in like K-5 setting, when they just maybe have their first student government, I'll ask the student government kids to stand up and I'll be like, I imagine your peers think of you as people who try hard, who want to make things better, and who are active in making your school all that it can be. But when you get a little bit older, politicians are seen as people who are only out for themselves. They don't care about a community and they're lying to everyone else. And that's not true. It's also not really true in how we see a lot of people in local, state, and even federal government. Most of the people at the local and state level aren't paid that well and are tryhards. And when I'm talking with middle schoolers, these are the yearbook committees of life. That's what these people are. They're just really trying to make sure we all have a record of it and have a good time. And so we have to be able to point out the positives in this, because our kids are going to get a negative message no matter where they are. And that's something that we can do as parents, is avoiding this knee-jerk negativity, finding the positivity, but also giving them space to have the conversation instead of saying it's off limits because it might offend someone's sensibilities.
And it's funny, as you were talking, you tied it back to what you were saying about role models. That often our students see the role model of the mayor in The Simpsons, which is a very negative portrayal. Whereas, as you're saying, especially on the state and the local level, most officials really just want to do well by their communities. Are there any role models you want to shout out that teachers may be able to use when they're teaching civics?
I think there are role models in every community, and I'll give you an example that happened to me 2 summers ago. When this book was getting ready to come out, my niece, who was then 7, said to me, Aunt Lindsay, I don't know who my mayor is. She lives in Kansas. I don't live there anymore. And I was, well, I don't either, but we can figure it out. We got online. We found out who her mayor was. He's a part-time mayor, as many of the mayors throughout the country are. We emailed him and said, hi, I'm going to be in town in the next few months. My niece is a constituent of yours. She'd love to meet you. And then we went out and met him at a festival that his office had been organizing. And it was really nice because she got so excited. It was really beautiful because she saw that this man, Mayor Bacon, was just a guy. He was a nice guy, could have been a friend, could have been a neighbor, could have been in the grocery store. And he had put on this really nice festival where the kids got their faces painted, there was food for sale, and there was outdoor music. And that's positive things. Every community has a role model. You might have to look kind of hard, but I guarantee you, in every part of our government, there is someone who's doing something that you can look up to. And it's helpful if you can engage your children with that activity and that sort of person.
Now, Lindsay, where can people find out more about you and the work you're doing? You already referenced a website, so if you can reference that again, that would also be great.
The website for the book is howtoraiseacitizen.com. And then for shorter form videos, I do have a decently active Instagram page that's called How to Raise a Citizen as well. I'm also very reachable by email. It's really easy to find me.
Lindsay, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. And thanks for doing this work. We need more people caring about it.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.